And joining me now is Mark Short, former Chief of Staff to then Vice President Mike Pence. Mark, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
Andrea, thanks for having me on.
Well, do you agree with Liz Cheney's assessment of the threat that Donald Trump poses if he's reelected?
I have a lot of respect for Liz Cheney and her family. I think they've served our country admirably, and I think that her views on January 6th were right. But I think some of the language is hyperbolic. I don't think that Donald Trump is looking to become a dictator in the United States. I think he served as president for 4 years. There were not moves to create a dictatorship, and some of that I think is again hyperbolic.
Well, speaking of hyperbolic, let me show you some of Donald Trump's recent comments, including the use of the word vermin to describe his opponents, whom he describes as enemies. That is a term, taken right out of the Nazi playbook. This is from Hallie Jackson's story today on the Today Show.
I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
If I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them.
On Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
He's also talked about canceling the Constitution, Mark. He's talked about getting rid of the civil service, changing the Justice Department, going after what he calls the deep state. So that as described in just quoting extensively from his recent speeches by the Washington Post, today the New York Times, the New Atlantic magazine. Yeah. There's a lot in there that is alarming a lot of people.
Sure, Angie. I'm not saying in any way that there isn't language to be concerned about, and I'm in no way looking to defend everything that Donald Trump has said. I am very proud of his record as president. I think he accomplished a lot of great things to the American people, but I'd say that perhaps most alarming in recent days are comments that suggest he would use the Department of Justice to attack political enemies. I think that is anathema to anything that conservatives or limited government Republicans once stood for and believed in, and so certainly a lot of his comments are concerning, but I think he also has always been a provocateur, and sometimes he says things intentionally to grab headlines. But yeah, I certainly would concur that the language is concerning. I don't think that necessarily means that he's looking to become a dictator, which I think is an exaggeration of where we stand.
Some people have been writing about the kind of people he would include around him as staff and in his cabinet, because he would no longer have people like Mike Pompeo, like General Kelly, General Mattis, whom he had previously, Mike Pence, for instance.
I think for much of the first 3.5 years, I think that Donald Trump was surrounded by strong advisors who I think helped to guide our country and enact policies on tax reform, enact foreign policy, enact Supreme Court confirmations of true conservatives that I think has made conservatives very proud. I'd say, honestly, the last 9 months, in many ways, I think it changed course, and I think many of those people had left the administration, and I think that what we ended up with on January 6th, in some ways, was a reflection of not having the same voice of conservatives around him that he had had for the first 3.5 years, and I think that is more representative of what perhaps a second term could look like.
Well, that's what is concerning people, that the last 9 months is more representative of what the next term would look like. With Rachel Maddow, Ms. Cheney also spoke about a January 4th phone call in which Trump lawyers were briefing surrogates about plans for January 6th. A lot of congressional members, including Freedom Caucus members, Judiciary Chair, suggesting that your boss, the former vice president, could refuse to count the electoral votes. And said she later learned that Vice President Pence's team was also alarmed by that call. Let's watch.
As I got off that call, I ran into the Capitol, into the office of the parliamentarian of the House to say, wait a minute, this is what I'm hearing is going to happen. What do we do about it in the joint session? How do we stop this? And that the vice president, ultimately, of course, did his duty bravely. Mm-hmm. But if you're in a joint session of Congress, you're not in a position where there are a lot of legislative steps that you can take, except to basically, move to adjourn. So it was a very dangerous and chilling moment.
Do you recall that either that phone call or the actions that the vice president took as a result of it?
Well, sure. I will always be proud of the actions that the vice president took on January 6th in defending the Constitution. And I think that that really was a conversation that a lot of people focus on that one day, but was a buildup over a couple of weeks. I think in many cases, we were at the center of that, and we're privy to a lot of conversations with, I think, some crackpot lawyers. And I think that it was really more of a Keystone Cops operation that, nonetheless troubling, I think was the president was again surrounding himself with people who were not giving the best advice, and there really wasn't that sort of infrastructure around him that would help to shield and protect from people who really should not have been whispering in the president's ear at that point. And I think it obviously created a tragic day on January 6th. But as far as the exact call on January 4th, I think there were a couple of weeks of those sorts of pressure campaigns that were put on the vice president's office. But ultimately, as I said, proud that the vice president defended his constitutional role on that day.
And there's a Republican debate again tomorrow night, and with the smallest field yet, Chris Christie now making the debate stage, but of course no Donald Trump. What do you think of the field right now, and is there a possibility that Mike Pence might be endorsing anyone soon?
Well, I really don't want to speak for him, but I think I'm not aware of any plans to endorse anytime soon, and I do think that what has transpired over the last several months is with each new indictment, I think that Republican voters have rallied around Donald Trump, and so even though there are debates ongoing, I think that Donald Trump's percentage continues to grow, and I think there's a lot of conversation that says you need to get down to one candidate, but I think that's a pretty simplistic view because it seems that as each candidate gets out, more support goes to Donald Trump. I think that's particularly the case with Ron DeSantis' support, that if he were ever to leave the race, more of his support would go back to Donald Trump. And so I think that we're headed toward a rematch that we had in 2020, unless something remarkable happens that's unforeseen at this point.